September 2nd, 1945, dawned gray and solemn over Tokyo Bay, where the USS Missouri rocked gently against her anchor chains, her massive guns silent for the first time in months. On her teak deck, beneath skies that threatened rain, American Captain Harold Stassen stood holding a worn naval cap in his weathered hands, his fingers tracing the imperial chrysanthemum emblem embroidered upon its band. Around him, dozens of Japanese officers waited in rigid formation. Their heads bare, their faces masks of stoic resignation. The war was over. What came next would define whether victors and vanquished could find something beyond vengeance, perhaps even honor in defeat's bitter aftermath. The ceremony taking place this morning had nothing to do with the formal surrender proceedings that would soon commence aboard this very battleship. This was something else entirely, something that had begun weeks earlier in the chaotic aftermath of Japan's capitulation. When imperial forces had laid down their arms across the Pacific, thousands of officers had been detained, processed, and stripped of their military regalia according to standard procedures. Their swords, their medals, their caps all had been confiscated as spoils of war, symbols of a militarism that had brought devastation to millions. Yet in the holding camps scattered across recently occupied territories, something unexpected had occurred. American officers tasked with processing the defeated enemy had begun to notice the particular anguish with which Japanese officers regarded the loss of their caps. These were not merely articles of uniform. In the rigid hierarchy of imperial military culture, the cap represented honor itself, the visible manifestation of years of service, sacrifice, and adherence to Bushido's demanding code. Commander James Holloway, who had supervised prisoner processing at a facility outside Manila, had been the first to propose what seemed like a radical idea. According to historical records preserved in the Naval War College archives, Holloway had written to his superiors suggesting that returning the caps minus any weapons or dangerous implements might serve American interests better than keeping them as trophies. His reasoning was pragmatic rather than sentimental. The occupation of Japan would require cooperation from the very officer class now imprisoned, and small gestures of respect might yield substantial dividends in the difficult months ahead. The proposal had worked its way up the chain of command, eventually reaching Admiral Chester Nimitz himself. The admiral, known for his strategic brilliance and his understanding that winning the peace required different weapons than winning the war, had given his approval. But he had insisted on one condition: the caps would be returned formally, ceremonially, in a manner that acknowledged both the defeat and the dignity of the men who had fought. Now, as Captain Stassen prepared to call the first name on his list, he reflected on the strangeness of this moment. Just months ago, he had commanded a destroyer escort in the fierce battles around Okinawa, had watched Japanese kamikaze pilots crash their planes into American ships, had seen friends torn apart by enemy fire. The hatred had been visceral, justified, overwhelming. Yet standing here, seeing these officers stripped of everything but their bare uniforms, he felt something shift. The first officer stepped forward when his name was called Commander Nakamura Shinji, formerly of the cruiser Haguro, sunk in the Malacca Strait. He moved with careful precision, his bearing still military despite the circumstances of his captivity. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering toward the cap in Captain Stassen's hands with an intensity that spoke of profound emotion held rigidly in check. Stassen extended the cap, and for a moment, the two men simply stood there, former enemies separated by 3 feet of deck space and an ocean of blood. Then Nakamura bowed, a shallow, formal acknowledgement, and accepted the cap. His hands trembled as he placed it upon his head, adjusting it with the automatic precision of countless repetitions. When he stepped back into formation, something had changed in his posture, a restoration, not of pride, perhaps, but of personhood. The ceremony continued through the morning, each name called, each cap returned. Some of the Japanese officers maintained their stoic composure throughout. Others betrayed the depth of their feelings in subtle ways, a tightening of the jaw, a brief closure of eyes, hands that gripped the returned caps as though they were lifelines thrown to drowning men. Lieutenant Robert Morrison, standing at attention near the Missouri's mainmast, had been skeptical about this entire proceeding. He had lost his brother at Pearl Harbor, had carried that rage through 4 years of savage warfare. When he had first heard about the plan to return the caps, he had argued against it in the officers' mess, his voice rising with anger. They deserve nothing, he had insisted. They started this war. They showed no mercy. Why should we? But Captain Stassen had asked him a question that Morrison couldn't easily answer. What kind of peace do you want, Lieutenant? One built on revenge, or one built on something that might actually last? Morrison still wasn't certain he knew the answer, but watching the ceremony unfold, he found his certainty wavering. Among the Japanese officers, reactions varied as profoundly as among their American counterparts. Captain Yoshida Mitsuru, formerly of the battleship Yamato, which had been sunk in April, with most of her crew, accepted his cap with visible emotion. He had survived when over 3,000 of his comrades had not, had been pulled from the water by American sailors who might just as easily have left him to drown. The cap they returned to him had been recovered from another officer's effects, not his own, but it carried the same meaning. According to accounts preserved in post-war interviews conducted by occupation authorities, Yoshida later stated that receiving that cap had allowed him to believe, for the first time since his nation's surrender, that his service had meant something beyond the catastrophic defeat. Others among the Japanese officers viewed the gesture with suspicion or even contempt. Lieutenant Commander Sato Hideo, a vocal proponent of fighting to the last man who had only reluctantly accepted the Emperor's surrender order, regarded the American officers with barely concealed hatred. When his cap was returned, he snatched it without the customary bow, his jaw set in defiance. To him, this ceremony was theater, a propaganda exercise designed to make the victors appear magnanimous, while Japan lay crushed beneath their boot. The morning wore on. Clouds thickened overhead, but the threatened rain held off. By 1100 hours, over 40 caps had been returned. As the ceremony progressed, observers began to gather along the Missouri's rail sailors, Marines, junior officers drawn by curiosity or orders to witness this unusual proceeding. Among them stood Ensign Thomas Chun, a Chinese-American officer from San Francisco, whose family had fled Japanese occupation in China. He watched the cap returns with conflicted feelings that defied easy categorization. Chun's parents had barely escaped Nanking before the massacre, had lost relatives to the brutality of the Imperial Army's advance. The accounts of atrocities, the comfort women, the death march, the medical experiments, these were not abstractions to him, but vivid realities that had shaped his entire understanding of this war. Yet watching these defeated officers receive their caps, he saw not monsters but men, and that recognition troubled him deeply. It doesn't seem right, does it? The voice came from, beside him, Seaman First Class Rodriguez, a gunner's mate from Texas whose ship had been hit by a kamikaze off Lady Gulfer. Rodriguez had spent 3 weeks in a hospital ship with burns covering 40% of his body. We treat them with respect while their people never showed any to ours. Chun considered his response carefully. Maybe that's the point, he said finally. Maybe we do it precisely because they didn't, to show there's a difference between us and them. Or maybe, Rodriguez countered, we're just being suckers. The philosophical debate playing out between these two young sailors was being replicated across the deck, across the fleet, across America itself. The question of how to treat a defeated enemy, especially one that had fought with such ferocity and committed such atrocities, had no easy answers. The Nuremberg trials were being planned, war criminals would face justice, but what about the thousands of ordinary officers who had simply served their nation as their culture had demanded? Captain Stassen called another name, Commander Tanaka Hiroshi, Imperial Japanese Navy. The officer who stepped forward was older than most, perhaps 55, with gray threading through his hair and deep lines etched around his eyes. He had been a career naval officer, had served in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905 as a young midshipman, had risen through the ranks during the long years of peace and then war. When Stassen extended Tanaka's cap, the older man's composure finally broke. His eyes filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Thank you," he said in heavily accented English, the first words any of the Japanese officers had spoken during the ceremony. "You do not have to do this. That you choose to. This I will remember." The moment stretched, freighted with meaning that transcended the simple return of a piece of cloth and brass. Stassen nodded, finding himself unexpectedly moved. The war is over, Commander. How we begin the peace matters. Historical records from this period, particularly those maintained by the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers during the occupation, document numerous such gestures during the immediate post-war period, though most never received public attention. This reference, drawn from declassified military communications archived at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, reveals a deliberate strategy of what Douglas MacArthur would later call dignified reconciliation, treating the defeated with sufficient respect to enable cooperation while maintaining clear authority. Below decks in the Missouri's wardroom, Admiral William Halsey listened to reports of the cap ceremony with mixed feelings. Halsey, known as Bull for his aggressive tactics and fierce hatred of the Japanese enemy, had initially opposed the gesture. His ships had fought through the entire Pacific campaign, from the desperate days after Pearl Harbor through the grinding battles of the Solomons, the Philippines, and finally the waters off Japan itself. He had lost men, good men, to enemy action, and the rage he felt toward those responsible had not diminished with victory. Yet Halsey was also a student of history, and he understood that wars end differently than they begin. The Treaty of Versailles after the First World War had imposed such humiliating terms on Germany that it had sown the seeds for the Second. Halsey did not want to see American forces fighting Japan again in another 20 years because the victors of 1945 had been too vindictive or too short-sighted. "How's it going up there?" he asked his aide, Lieutenant Commander Bowman. "Smoothly, sir. The Japanese officers are maintaining discipline. Captain Stassen is handling it well," Halsey grunted. "Make sure it's documented, photographs, written records. If we're going to do this, we're going to be able to prove we did it right." He paused, then added, "And make damn sure those caps are the only things being returned." "No swords, no weapons of any kind," already confirmed, Admiral. The caps were inspected thoroughly. Nothing but cloth and brass buttons. On deck, the ceremony moved into its second hour. Among the Japanese officers awaiting their turn stood Lieutenant Kobayashi Takeshi, a naval aviator who had flown from the carrier Shokaku before her sinking at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Kobayashi had been shot down during one of the final kamikaze operations, had been pulled from the water by an American submarine that had surfaced to rescue a downed American pilot and had found both men clinging to wreckage. The American pilot, Lieutenant William Brennan of VF-17, had argued with his rescuers to take the Japanese pilot aboard rather than leave him to drown. Brennan had lost friends to kamikazes, had every reason to want revenge, but in that moment floating in the Pacific, he had seen only another pilot who had fought bravely and deserved to live. The submarine commander had made the controversial decision to take Kobayashi prisoner rather than leaving him. Now, months later, Kobayashi stood in formation waiting to receive his cap from officers of the same nation that had shown him unexpected mercy. The irony was not lost on him. He had been trained to die for the emperor, had volunteered for a suicide mission, had failed even in that. The shame of survival had been crushing, made worse by his capture and the knowledge that he would never fly again. When his name was called and Captain Stassen extended his cap, Kobayashi found himself thinking of Lieutenant Brennan, wondering if the American pilot had survived the war, if he knew that his act of mercy had rippled forward to this moment. Kobayashi took his cap, bowed deeply, more deeply than military protocol strictly required, and returned to formation with his head held higher than it had been in months. By early afternoon, the ceremony was drawing to its conclusion. Only a dozen officers remained to receive their caps, and the American officers conducting the proceedings were feeling the strain of maintaining formal bearing for so many hours. Yet there was also a sense among them that something significant had occurred, though none could quite articulate what it was. Among the final officers to be called was Captain Fukita Michuo, the naval aviator who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. His presence at the ceremony was controversial. Several American officers had argued that Fukita, above all others, deserved no gestures of respect or reconciliation. He had been the tactical commander of the operation that had killed over 2,000 Americans and dragged the United States into war. But Admiral Nimitz, in approving the cap ceremony, had insisted on including all captured officers of appropriate rank, without exceptions based on their specific wartime roles. If we start making distinctions, Nimitz had argued, we undermine the entire purpose. Either we treat them as officers worthy of basic respect, or we don't. We can't do it halfway. Now, Fuchida stepped forward, his face carefully neutral, betraying nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind his eyes. Captain Stassen, who knew exactly who this man was and what he had done, felt his jaw tighten. Every instinct screamed at him to throw the cap into the sea, to make this man feel even a fraction of the humiliation he had inflicted on the United States Navy. Instead, Stassen did his duty. He extended the cap. Captain Fuchida. Fuchida took it without speaking, without bowing, his eyes meeting Stassen's for just a moment. In that brief connection, Stassen saw neither remorse nor defiance, but something harder to define, a kind of exhausted acknowledgement that the world had changed utterly, that nothing would ever be as it had been. Years later, in his autobiography, Fuchida would write about this moment, describing it as the first crack in the certainty that had defined his military life. According to his account, published in 1953, the simple act of receiving his cap from an American officer forced him to confront the humanity of those he had been taught to see as enemies. It would be one of many experiences that eventually led to his controversial conversion to Christianity and his later work as an evangelist, but that transformation still lay in the future. On this gray September morning, he was simply a defeated officer trying to maintain dignity in the face of absolute defeat. The final cap was returned to Lieutenant Commander Iwata Shinji, a submarine officer whose vessel had been depth-charged and sunk in the South Pacific. Iwata had spent 18 hours in the water before being rescued by an American destroyer, the same destroyer whose depth charges had killed most of his crew. The American captain had treated the survivors with surprising decency, providing medical care and reasonably humane imprisonment, but Iwata had carried the guilt of survival and the shame of capture ever since. As the last officer returned to formation, Captain Stassen stepped back and nodded to Commander Holloway, who called the assembled Japanese officers to attention. For a long moment, the deck was silent except for the creaking of the ship's timbers and the cry of gulls wheeling overhead. Then Stassen spoke, his voice carrying across the deck. "Officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, you have fought bravely for your nation. That fight is over. We return these to you," he gestured to the caps now on their heads, "not to honor the war you fought, but to acknowledge the service you rendered according to your understanding of duty. What comes next will be difficult for all of us. How we conduct ourselves in the days ahead will determine what kind of peace follows this war. You are dismissed." It was not a long speech, nor particularly eloquent, but its plainness carried its own power. The Japanese officers bowed as one, a synchronized movement that was almost shocking in its precision after the chaos and disorganization of defeat. Then they filed off the deck in orderly ranks, heading back to the transport ships that would carry them to processing centers and, eventually, home. As they departed, Lieutenant Morrison approached Captain Stassen. The young officer's face was troubled. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" "Granted. I'm not sure I understand what we accomplished here today. Those men started a war that killed thousands of Americans. We just treated them like honored guests. Where's the justice in that?" Stassen was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the Japanese officers disappear below decks. "Justice and revenge aren't the same thing, Lieutenant. Those men will face justice. War criminals will be tried, and all of them will live in a defeated nation occupied by foreign troops. That's consequence enough. But if we want them to cooperate with the occupation, if we want to build a Japan that won't go to war again in 20 years, we need them to see us as something other than vindictive conquerors. So it's just strategy? A calculated gesture?" "It's many things," Stassen replied. "Strategy, yes, but also recognition that they're human beings who serve their nation as we served ours. That doesn't excuse atrocities or war crimes, but it does mean we can acknowledge military service without endorsing the cause it served. The cap of an enemy officer is still the cap of an officer. Returning it costs us nothing and might gain us cooperation we'll desperately need." Morrison nodded slowly, still processing. "My brother died at Pearl Harbor, sir. Part of me thinks those men don't deserve even this small dignity." "I know, Lieutenant, I know. But your brother died so we could win this war. The question now is whether we can win the peace. That requires different courage than battle does, the courage to see enemies as potential allies, to believe that change is possible. Stassen placed a hand on Morrison's shoulder. You don't have to forgive them. None of us do. But we have to find a way forward, or we'll be back here fighting the same war all over again. Below decks on the transport ship that would carry them to shore, the Japanese officers gathered in the hold assigned to prisoners of war. The space was cramped and poorly ventilated, lit by harsh electric bulbs that cast stark shadows. But the mood among the men was markedly different from what it had been that morning. The return of their caps, simple as it was, had shifted something fundamental in their psychological state. Commander Nakamura, the first officer to receive his cap, sat on his bunk running his fingers along its brim. Around him, other officers were doing the same, touching their caps, adjusting them, simply holding them as if to confirm they were real. Lieutenant Commander Sato, who had accepted his cap with barely concealed hostility, still wore his, refusing to remove it even in the closer confines of the hold. "What do you make of it?" asked Captain Yoshida, addressing the group in general. "Why would they do this? What purpose does it serve them?" "Propaganda," Sato replied immediately, his voice bitter. "They want to appear magnanimous, to show the world that America is generous in victory." "It means nothing." But Tanaka, the older officer who had wept upon receiving his cap, shook his head. "I don't think so. Or at least, I think it's more complicated than that. The American captain who returned these could have done it mechanically, could have made it perfunctory. Instead, he did it with ceremony, with formality. He treated us as officers, not as conquered subjects to be humiliated. "We are conquered subjects," another officer pointed out. "Japan has surrendered unconditionally. We have no status, no rights beyond what they choose to grant us." "Precisely," Tanaka said, "which is why this matters. They could treat us any way they wished. That they chose this ... double quote," he trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. Fuchida, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was quiet but carried authority that made others listen. "I've been thinking about the American pilot who pulled me from my damaged plane during a training accident in 1937. I was flying in California, learning American techniques. The plane developed engine trouble, and I had to bail out over farmland. A crop duster pilot saw me come down, landed his plane in a field, and drove me to safety in his truck. He didn't know I was Japanese Navy, he just saw a pilot in trouble." The officers listened, unsure where this story was leading. "I think about that moment often," Fuchida continued. "About how that American treated me with simple human decency, not because of who I was or what nation I served, but because I was another pilot in need of help. Today on that deck I felt that same thing again. Not forgiveness, the American captain's eyes were too hard for forgiveness, but acknowledgement of our common humanity, despite everything." In the days following the cap ceremony, word of the event spread through the occupation forces and eventually to the Japanese population. The reaction was mixed and complex, reflecting the enormous difficulty of transitioning from total war to uncertain peace. Some American servicemen felt the gesture had been too generous, that defeated enemies deserved no such considerations. Others, particularly those who would be staying in Japan as part of the occupation forces, recognized it as a small but potentially significant step toward workable relations with the population they would be governing. Among the Japanese, reactions were equally varied. Some saw it as confirmation that the Americans, despite their overwhelming military victory, might be reasonable occupiers who would not exact harsh vengeance. Others viewed it as a cynical ploy, a calculated gesture designed to pacify the population, while American forces consolidated control over every aspect of Japanese life. Lieutenant Kobayashi, the naval aviator who had been saved by American submarine crew, found himself assigned to work with occupation authorities as a translator and liaison officer. His English, learned during a pre-war exchange program, made him valuable to administrators trying to navigate the complexities of governing a defeated nation. In this role, he witnessed numerous interactions between American forces and Japanese civilians, and he began to understand that the cap ceremony had been part of a larger strategic approach. According to records maintained by the occupation government and later made available to researchers, General Douglas MacArthur's administration deliberately pursued a policy of preserving Japanese dignity wherever possible while implementing fundamental reforms. This approach was controversial among those who wanted harsh punishment for Japanese aggression, but MacArthur argued that a humiliated Japan would become unstable and potentially dangerous again, while a reformed Japan that maintained cultural pride might become a stable democratic ally. The cap ceremony, small as it was, exemplified this philosophy. It acknowledged the military tradition and concept of honor that was central to Japanese culture, while also establishing American authority and control. The American officers returned the caps from a position of unquestioned superiority. There was no ambiguity about who had won the war, but they did so in a manner that allowed Japanese officers to maintain self-respect. Commander Tanaka, in a diary entry dated September 10, 1945, wrote about the ceremony's impact on his own thinking. For weeks since the surrender, I have felt that everything I devoted my life to was rendered meaningless by defeat. The return of my cap by the American captain did not erase that defeat, but it allowed me to believe that service itself, regardless of outcome, has inherent dignity. This may seem like a small thing, but it has given me reason to continue living when I had begun to question whether there was any point. The Missouri's cap ceremony would not become widely known outside military circles until years later, when participants began publishing memoirs and historians started piecing together the complex story of the immediate post-war period. But its effects rippled outward in ways both subtle and significant. Many of the Japanese officers who received their caps that day would go on to play important roles in rebuilding Japan. Their willingness to work with occupation authorities influenced at least in part by early experiences like this one. Captain Yoshida became an advisor to the new Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, helping to rebuild a navy stripped of offensive capability but still capable of defending the nation's waters. He frequently spoke about the importance of understanding American military culture and working cooperatively with the American forces that would remain in Japan for decades. In interviews late in his life, he always mentioned the cap ceremony as a formative experience that shaped his approach to U.S.-Japan relations. Lieutenant Commander Sato, who had accepted his cap with such resentment, took a different path. He returned to civilian life and became a vocal critic of what he saw as Japan's excessive deference to American interests. Yet even Sato acknowledged in an essay written in 1963 that the cap ceremony had presented him with a paradox he never fully resolved. How could the Americans simultaneously represent an occupying force imposing foreign values on Japan and yet demonstrate genuine respect for Japanese military tradition? For the American officers involved, the ceremony also left lasting impressions. Captain Stassen went on to become a prominent political figure, serving as governor of Minnesota and later as an advisor on disarmament issues. In his speeches about international relations, he often referenced his experiences in the immediate aftermath of World War II, arguing that treating defeated enemies with dignity was not just morally right but strategically wise. Lieutenant Morrison, who had been so troubled by the ceremony, eventually came to see it as one of the most important lessons of his military service. In a letter to his sister written in 1946, he reflected, "I joined the Navy to fight our enemies and avenge our dead. I succeeded in fighting, but I've learned that vengeance is a poor foundation for peace. The cap ceremony taught me that we can acknowledge courage in our enemies without excusing their crimes, and that the hardest part of war is not the fighting, but the reconciliation that must follow." The broader significance of gestures like the cap ceremony became clearer as the occupation proceeded, and Japan began its remarkable transformation from militaristic empire to democratic nation. The relationship between victor and vanquished, built on thousands of daily interactions large and small, shaped the outcome as much as formal policies and treaties. The decision to treat defeated Japanese officers with basic respect, even when it felt uncomfortable or unearned, contributed to a working relationship that allowed for cooperation rather than festering resentment. On September 2, 1945, as the formal surrender ceremony concluded aboard the Missouri and General MacArthur made his historic address about a new day dawning, The dozens of Japanese officers who had received their caps earlier that morning stood among the witnesses. They wore those caps with quiet dignity, symbols of a defeated military, but also of service rendered and honor maintained despite catastrophic defeat. It was a small moment in the vast sweep of history, easily overlooked amid the grand drama of surrender and occupation, yet it captured something essential about how wars truly end, not just with signatures on surrender documents, but with countless individual choices about how to treat those who were, just yesterday, mortal enemies, and must somehow become, tomorrow, partners in building an uncertain peace.